Good afternoon and welcome to the ReHousing Lecture Series. As Judith said, it's titled Addressing Housing Inequalities and Climate Change in the Barcelona Metropolitan Area Towards Equity-Driven Housing Retrofits. So I'm Melissa García-Lamarca. I'm an assistant professor at Lund University, and I'm on the advisory board of the ReHousing project. And this is a collective paper that's under development with Adrià Carbonell and Isabel Anguelovski, who are both at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. So what we're doing in this paper is bringing together rehousing research in Catalonia that's been underway in the past few years with research I've done on retrofits and housing justice in 2023. So we're excited to present this paper and engage with you on this. So Adrià will first start by presenting, giving an outline of the importance of this topic and situating it theoretically, outlining our research questions and the main argument and the contributions we seek to make to the literature with this paper. And then I'll talk more about the methodology, give some context on the Spanish case and retrofit architecture before getting into the case study and our findings and analysis. So we're looking forward to any questions and comments after the webinar. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Adrià. And please let me know and I'll pass the slides when you're
Fantastic.
ready.
So we can go to the first slide. So to set the stage a bit, it's worth for us to recognize the scale of what's happening across Europe with the EU's Recovery and Resilience Facility directing around 65.3 billion euros across 26 member states, specifically for housing retrofits. So this is an enormous injection of public resources into the built environment, resources intended to improve energy performance, reduce emissions, and lower household energy costs. And this trend has extended far beyond Europe, including countries in the global south, like Colombia here, that we've shown the little banner of. And so while on the surface, that can sound unambiguously great and good, we'll see over the next few minutes in our presentation that the way that retrofit programs are designed and delivered matters enormously for who actually benefits and who might get left behind. Next slide. So when we looked at the existing literature, a number of important gaps stood out. Research on the unequal outcomes of retrofit programs is still relatively limited. Work by Balzarowski and colleagues, and more recently by Ross, Cartney, and Mulligan, has begun to map these dynamics, but there's still much that we don't know, particularly about how planners and public agencies actively try to counteract those unequal outcomes through the design and the delivery of the retrofit itself. We also know from Perez Navarro and others that energy efficiency funding tends to carry distributive biases, meaning that the money doesn't flow equally and those most in need of improvement are often least likely to receive it. And there's also a structural gap in the literature around high ownership contexts. Much of the retrofit research has focused on social or rental housing, but what happens when the majority of residents own their homes? So these dynamics are quite a bit different. And similarly, we lack research on the peripheral areas of metropolitan regions, places where investments don't always reach, but where the risk of gentrification or renovictions from the retrofits are more limited and worth examining as potential models. Next slide. So against this backdrop, we've organized our inquiry around two core questions. The first is, how can housing retrofit planning and implementation actually counteract these inequities and not just avoid reinforcing them, specifically in contexts where home ownership is dominant and vulnerable groups also own their homes? Second, and more practically, what are the everyday practices that planners and public officials deploy to make national retrofit programs work more equitably on the ground? And because there's often a significant gap between policy design at the national level and what actually happens in a specific neighborhood with a specific community, we wanted to understand that translation process. Next slide. So our central and main argument here is that retrofit equity does not happen automatically, and it cannot be achieved through technical solutions alone. It requires transparent, ongoing, place-based support. What in Spanish we call acompañamiento or accompaniment. That is not a simple one-off consultation, but a sustained and relational presence over time. It also requires that both the process and the content of retrofit implementation directly intersect with what residents need most. So core needs like accessibility, affordability, and livability. And where possible, retrofit efforts should contribute to building collective capacity within communities while actively mitigating the risk of future unequal impacts, including displacement. Next slide. So in terms of where this work sits theoretically, we're drawing on and contributing to several bodies of literature. Equity planning has a long tradition in US-based scholarship, and more recent work has been done on reparative and emancipatory planning. We see this research as extending those frameworks into a European context and into the specific domain of greening, green infrastructure, and the energy transition. There's also a growing body of work at the intersection of urban greening, sustainability, and justice that has documented the paradoxical effects of green programs, where they improve environmental indicators, but while displacing or burdening lower income residents. An EU-based equity planning scholarship on neighborhood-based approaches has also rarely incorporated green or climate lens, with some exceptions, which we're trying to fill that gap. And finally, such a focus is key in light of these equity gaps in multi-level environmental governance and the massive mobilization around housing and anti-evictions that have shaped the political landscape, particularly in Spain. And I'll hand it off to you, Melissa.
Thanks, Adrià. Great. So to talk a bit about our methodology. So in this paper, we focus on the case study of this neighborhood called Sant Ildefons in Cornellà de Llobregat. You can see it here on the map. So this is a working class city in the Barcelona Metropolitan Area, the red circled area. And for those of you who know Barcelona, it's just north of the airport along the Llobregat River there, you can see. So you can see the location in Catalonia, which is one of 17 autonomous communities in Spain. So because of the way that governance and retrofit processes and funding work, we embed this look at Sant Ildefons in an analysis of a multi-level housing retrofit programs and planning. So looking at the Spanish level in Catalonia and the Barcelona Metropolitan Area. This is also really important because housing is a regional competency in Spain. So that means that there's national laws and policy frameworks, but the autonomous communities are responsible for implementing them. The other dimension of our methodology, so I mentioned at the start, we're bringing together two data sets, data that's been collected in the ReHousing project that Adrià and Isabel have been involved with as part of work packages 2, 3, and 4. So this is around national reports on housing inequalities, retrofit programs, and owner-occupied housing systems and welfare regimes. They also held a policy lab in 2025 with representatives of the Catalan government and the Barcelona Metropolitan Area to reflect on existing housing inequalities and green policies. And also the second data set comes from research that I conducted in 2023 on retrofits in Spain, thinking about questions around housing justice and climate justice. So this involved 24 interviews with public, private, community sector actors involved with retrofit at national, regional, and local levels. So about half of the interviews were focused on the Barcelona metropolitan area, specifically Barcelona, Cornellà, and Santa Coloma. And I also was able, in of 2023, to attend and observe 6 meetings of homeowner associations with architects and social workers in Sant Ildefons. So this is where the housing associations talk about the retrofits they want to undertake. And also had a focus group with residents living in buildings undergoing retrofit and some archival research. So this paper is drawing from these different sources. So before getting into the kind of the multi-level analysis and the Cornellà case, the Sant Ildefons case, I wanted to first provide some key dimensions of the Spanish housing context, which were really important to understand to situate this work. And this reflects this Catalan context as well. So 85% of the Spanish building stock has an energy performance certificate of E, F, or G. And this is really crucial because over half of the homes, main homes that exist now were built before 1980. So this was before there was any thermal regulation or obligations on insulation in buildings. The other key dimension here is the high rates of energy poverty. In Spain, it doubles the EU energy poverty rate, where 20% of households cannot heat their homes in the winter. So obviously improving housing quality is really crucial in this context. In terms of the tenure structure and the housing stock, Spain has about 77% of the tenure is property ownership. And this has really fallen since the peak of the housing boom. At one point was 84% in 2008. And you can see here, 50% of these have their property paid for, and about 28% have a mortgage outstanding. The private rental sector, you can see it's 20%. So that's grown dramatically in the past 10 years. And it's even more in large cities like Barcelona and Madrid, it can be up to 30%. And most notable in the Spanish case, which you might know, is that there's very marginal public and social housing. The last note here is also important. There's been an influx of external capital to invest in the private rental market, but we're also seeing Spanish households becoming landlords increasingly since the 2008 crisis. So the other key point here is the housing stock. So 68% of the housing stock is in multifamily buildings, and 47% of these have 10 or more flats. So this is really important because the way that retrofits is in agreement among property owners. And because properties are fragmented within buildings, it makes it quite difficult for homeowner associations to agree on the need to intervene in usually the retrofit is the building envelope, the roof, and the windows. So this has been a huge challenge in the Spanish context for retrofits in general. It's also important to say something more broadly about housing inequality in the context of climate change in the Spanish context. So a lot of studies have shown that low-income and marginalized neighborhoods in the center, but especially the periphery of cities, are disproportionately affected by climate change impacts, like overheating, flooding, pollution. And they also have insufficient green spaces and services where people can cool off, especially in the summer months. This also brings health impacts, especially for elderly populations and migrant populations who are unable to leave the city in the summer months, urban areas. Furthermore, we also know that many of these polígonos de vivienda, these kind of large-scale aging housing blocks, are now inhabited by socioeconomically vulnerable populations who have little to no resources to be able to mitigate or adapt to climate impacts. So they don't have money to replace windows, even install air conditioning, or to address moisture and mold in flats. A lot of the peripheral housing areas haven't been the focus of state action on housing rehabilitation. In the 1980s, this really focused on historic city centers. And it's only been in the past decade or so that the national, regional, and local governments have recognized these peripheral neighborhoods face significant housing deficiencies because of poor construction, materials, insulation, and accessibility. And now the vulnerabilities of populations that live there that cannot fund action. So this is how the first kind of retrofit programs emerged in Spain, in Zaragoza and Santa Coloma, which I'll mention later. This is the last slide, a bit on the housing context analysis. So it's key to really note the bigger picture of the deep and long-lasting housing inequalities and speculation that provide the backdrop to the Spanish case. So we can still very much see the legacy of the 1997 to 2007 housing boom, where housing prices increased 220% and housing became deeply commodified. This is still very present. And we're seeing affordability pressures, especially in medium to large cities across Spain, from transnational investments and large-scale tourism, which is especially impacting the rental sector now. Metropolitan regions, particularly Barcelona and Madrid, are facing a lot of pressure with housing prices and rents rising, especially in neighborhoods that are well connected through public transit to the urban core. And finally, we also wanted to underline there's a clear racial dimension to housing inequalities. And I personally saw this in my research on mortgage indebtedness during the housing boom and crash in 2008, where the terms and conditions of mortgages were notably worse for migrant populations in terms of more abusive clauses in the mortgage and the requirement of more guarantors. And recent studies, for example, this one from Provivienda, have shown how racism and discrimination in the rental market generates urban segregation in Madrid and Barcelona that's limiting access to immigrant populations in certain parts of the city. So I wanted to turn now to give a sense of the retrofit architecture and governance in Spain, Catalonia, and then how this is reaching the Barcelona metropolitan region and to our case study of Sant Ildefons. So this is what I'll do over the next few slides. So in 2021, this was really a game changer in the Spanish context, receiving 69, almost 0.5 billion euros in grants from the EU as part of the COVID recovery, the Recovery and Resilience Facility. So it's called the Next Generation Funding. So there are 30 parts of the Spanish plan, and part 2 focuses on the housing retrofit and urban regeneration piece of the puzzle. So half of the 6.8 billion euros has been allocated specifically to renovate housing, existing housing. And the goal of this is to retrofit 500,000 housing units by the end of this year. So this is underway, and the retrofits should technically be finished by the end of this year. So this is kind of the Spanish part of the renovation wave. And you can see the bold boxes are the intervention programs, program 1, 3, and 4. So we're going to focus on these area-based grants. But there's also grants outside of the area funding for building and also individual housing units. And just number 2 are kind of as funding for the one-stop shops to help support people to access retrofits, to get information, and also the technical documentation is for the architects when they undertake this. So this is all regulated through a royal decree at the national level. So in terms of how these 3.4 billion euros were being distributed, the Spanish government decided to distribute it equally by population across the territory. So you can see here Andalusia received the most because it's the most populous autonomous community. Catalonia was second, and then Madrid, and so on. So this royal decree that I mentioned, again, you see at the bottom of the screen here, it obliges at least 30% of the funds to be used in area-based grants, which are up to the autonomous communities to decide how to do this, but they're meant to be distributed to more vulnerable areas. Most autonomous communities in Spain have one housing management structure, but Catalonia is unique because it has 3 levels of housing competencies, and so 3 different governing bodies to implement retrofits. So there's the Catalan Housing Agency, which is responsible for the oversight and getting their part of like all the retrofits done just for Catalonia. And they also take care of the Catalan territory outside the metropolitan area and the city of Barcelona. There's the City of Barcelona's Housing Consortium, which is responsible to implement that in Barcelona, and then the Metropolitan Housing Consortium, which is where we'll be focusing. This is, of course, part of the metropolitan area where the case study we're looking at is located. So each of these consortiums or agencies run their own calls for the programs on area-based funding, building, and apartment retrofits, but they coordinated by the housing agency in Catalonia. And you can see here on the bottom left that Catalonia decided to allocate 41% of the area-based grants to the area-based interventions, and over the 30% set nationally at the minimum level. So zooming into the Metropolitan Housing Consortium before we go to Sant Ildefons, what's really key is this retrofit plan that the Metropolitan Housing Consortium released around 2020 to address energy efficiency retrofits. So what they did in this plan is they mapped all the multi-family building stock built before 1980 in the metropolitan area. They mapped energy use and disposable family income using data from the census section. This is the smallest data available on the spatial mapping in Spain. So from here, they developed 4 programs according to different levels of disposable family income, because they basically saw the ability to retrofit and the support needed in multifamily buildings is really directly connected to disposable family income. So program 4 was designed from this as the lowest income area census section. So disposable family income is below 24,000 euros per year here. And they identified 11 neighborhoods in 4 cities, in the cities of Cornellà, Hospitalet, Santa Coloma, and Badalona in the metropolitan area. And this is where the neighborhood here, you can see on the map, Sant Ildefons is one of them. So importantly, this plan uses a legal tool in the Catalan housing law from 2007 called conservation and rehabilitation areas. So this gives the public administration the power to manage and oversee the retrofit process in private housing. And this is the mechanism that's been used in Sant Ildefons, which I'll come back to in a moment. But I first wanted to get into the neighborhood to give you a sense of what this place is and how it evolved. So this neighborhood was built as part of the Franco dictatorship, which was one of the longest dictatorships in Europe, almost 40 years, part of the social urgency plan in 1958. So this was a time when there's a huge amount of migration happening, especially from southern Spain towards northern industrializing areas, which was part of a political project of the dictatorship to kind of Spanishize, especially Catalonia and the Basque region, these parts. And in Sant Ildefons, a lot of migrants were working in factories like Siemens, Pirelli, and other industries. So the private company Construcciones Españolas was the one that collaborated with the dictatorship to build social housing in many areas, and they received generous subsidies and a lot of administrative and fiscal benefits. So they were awarded the contract to build Sant Ildefons in 1959. And they quickly built dozens and dozens of housing blocks with poor quality materials and no insulation throughout the 1960s. So over this period, up until the early 1970s, there were about 10,000 housing units built, and services like sidewalks, social infrastructures were slow to follow. And at the time, it was one of the largest housing concentrations in Catalonia. The neighborhood has long been stigmatized. In the 1980s, it was popularly known as Sant Ildefons, and it was infamous for drug use and delinquency. In the housing boom from 1997 to 2007, there was an influx of migrants from around 80 different countries, especially Morocco, who have now really become an integral part of the neighborhood in the neighborhood today. And it's still considered a socially and economically peripheral neighborhood, although the metro, bus, and light rail provide direct connections to the city center in Barcelona. So in 2021, the Metropolitan Housing Consortium used this rehabilitation and conservation area mechanism to declare one in Sant Ildefons, as you can see on this map, the outlined blocks. So there's 150 multifamily properties with a total of about 3,650 housing units. So this conservation area, this ACR, gave the consortium the authority to oversee the retrofit process and to enable this large-scale renovation. I also wanted to highlight where the housing office is here on the map. So they're the key local partner of the housing consortium in Sant Ildefons in terms of reaching neighbors and being accessible to them. I'm going to come back to that in a few slides, but I wanted to highlight them here. So it's first crucial to say that this planning tool, the ACR, was first used for housing retrofit in Catalonia in Santa Coloma in 2015. You can see this street, Calle Pirineus, was retrofitted. You can see the bottom right, how it turned out. And in an interview with an architect from Santa Coloma who worked on this project, he basically told me that energy efficiency investments in low-income housing are not investable in terms of payback periods recognized by the state and financial sector because energy use is low in the first place, because there's a lot of energy poverty. So he basically said, if the city wouldn't have done this and provided loans and do these interventions, no one would. So the Sant Ildefons retrofit has basically scaled up this Santa Coloma experience as it is embedded in this larger retrofit plan in the program 4. So again, Sant Ildefons is one of these 4 neighborhoods. So using this legal mechanism, it's the first time we're scaling up this intervention in the Catalan context. It's also important to mention that as part of the retrofit plan, Metropolitan Housing Consortium applied for and received funding from the European Investment Bank. So they received 2.8 million to provide technical monitoring, quality, and mediation support through this. So I think in the bottom right of the slide, I really want to emphasize what's really crucial here is that a portion of this 3.4 billion of funds that arrived to Spain under the Next Generation funds were used, a piece of this was used by the metropolitan area with a plan in place to support vulnerable areas. So it was used to top up and provide further accompaniment to homeowner associations, which is really key for retrofit equity. So just to get on, this slide gives you a sense of what the building typologies are. You can see how the buildings look now in Sant Ildefons. These are some of them that are now being retrofitted and are probably going to be finished very soon. In terms of our key findings that we uncovered through this research, so the housing office in Cornellà, which I showed you on the map before, that relocated to the Sant Ildefons neighborhood, has really played a fundamental role as the local face of the public retrofit program. And this is really important because the Metropolitan Housing Consortium is an unknown entity that people can't contact or speak to, even though it was explained in the first meetings who they were. Residents have no contact with this. It's a very it's a more macro metropolitan area consortium. So this is why also in the preparation for this, the housing office moved to this neighborhood to be at the heart of Sant Ildefons. So the professionals that work there, and especially the social workers and director, are really highly trusted professionals and known by the neighbors. Each homeowner association had about half a dozen formal meetings that were held in the housing office with architects and social workers, where these were funded by this European Investment Bank funds to discuss interventions for energy efficiency, accessibility, and also aesthetics of the building. So the housing office also operated as a key drop-in, like a more informal drop-in space. So there are the formal meetings with the architects, but then this informal space of the housing office was really important for residents' doubts, especially at the start. Especially a lot of there's a large elderly community in this neighborhood, and it was important for them to be able to drop into the office and say, hey, last meeting we talked about these payments, why doesn't it include this? So this was a really crucial function of the housing office in this kind of larger approach if we think about the equity dimensions. In terms of the third bullet on this slide, for a lot of households, the energy efficiency dimension is more abstract. So people, yes, they want lower energy bills, but they're not necessarily willing to pay for it or able to pay for it, and it's not a priority for them. But improving accessibility, comfort, and livability of homes through adding lifts or extending balconies was a concrete improvement in everyday living conditions. And it was really important to attract homeowner associations to take part in the retrofits. Financial barriers are probably the biggest element holding back low-income households from taking retrofits. So thanks to these next generation funds, the Metropolitan Housing Consortium can give an interest-free loan that ranges between 50 to 100 euros per year for the non-subsidized portion of the retrofit. And this is decided on the interventions are decided by the homeowner. So what's also crucial here is that homeowners don't have to pay upfront, and they only start to pay once the intervention is completed. Finally, this last point is a more kind of meta finding. We found that equity-minded planners develop discretionary and relational and political capacities to translate top-down retrofit agendas into locally just outcomes. So for example, the political capacity, we can see it by how the Metropolitan Housing Consortium created a retrofit program building on the Santa Coloma experience, right? They kind of mobilize that into a political, to advance their political capacity there. And we also see the relational dimension and how the consortium works hand in hand with the housing office on the local territory in Sant Ildefons. Just to give a sense, this is a render of how one of the projects will look when it's complete. So you can see the extended balconies, the lift, and the building envelope, which you can see the windows are a bit set inwards. So the envelope has been, they're putting about 4 centimeter thick insulation to improve the energy efficiency of the building. So getting towards the end of the presentation, we wanted to share some key takeaways and moving towards equity-driven retrofits from this case that we looked at closely. So this continued prolonged high investment in technical assistance and staffing, this kind of one-stop shop located in the neighborhood for all stages of the retrofit process, taking a needs-based approach supported by dedicated professionals who are known and trusted by residents is really crucial. We also wanted to underline in the second point, the importance of a highly structured and pedagogic way to engage residents, where there's planning, follow-up, and space for resident input through formal meetings and also through informal drop-ins to the housing office. Also, rather than selling the project through energy retrofits, which might not speak to people so clearly, the focus is really on core residential needs and preferences, where there's questions of livability, comfort, and accessibility and affordability are really key. The final important takeaway is this reinforced financial commitment from the Metropolitan Housing Consortium, and the support from the Next Generation funds are able to alleviate burdens on socially vulnerable residents. Although if people take the option of the 100% grant, it can penalize them in the long term. If there's questions, we can talk more about this, but this basically works. that if people earn below a certain amount, the 2 to 3 times less the sufficient income indicator, which is used to assess social benefits. So if people earn less than 1,500 to 2,200 euros per month, they're eligible for 100% retrofit grant. So here, the extra part given by the state, so the 60% that's normally covered by the interest-free loan, is registered as debt in the property registry and must be paid back plus the consumer price index when the property is inherited or sold. So in many ways, it kind of penalizes the most vulnerable households unable to pay the monthly loan payments. And this is something that's particular to the Catalan and Valencian case, where this debt is registered and need to be paid back by vulnerable households. In terms of our more theoretical takeaways, we propose that equity planning can consist in a mediating and simplifying role that ensures trust building, support, and technical and financial feasibility for and with residents through this construction of the accompanimiento infrastructure. By simplifying, what we're trying to say here is that the complexity of retrofit is reduced by facilitating access to architects, to advice, to financing, among other elements. And Adrià talked about acompañamiento at the start, but we thought this word was really good in Spanish because it goes beyond support. It's kind of like walking side by side, and it's this relational dimension that Adrià mentioned with households on the way to retrofit. And the Housing Office showed very well how this can be done. Equity planning in the context of retrofits can also help mobilize energy financing towards these more diverse and complementary daily needs of socially vulnerable residents, like to improve the quality of life, comfort, and to address affordability concerns, which are dimensions really most pressing for them. And this last point in particular, in Spain, green equity planning for retrofits builds on and extends an existing tradition of socially oriented neighborhood regeneration schemes and laws, like the Llei de Barris, which is very well known in the Catalan context, and for these more large-scale project execution. But what's important to note is that the retrofits operate outside of these schemes, and they're not integrated into them. And this is something that needs to be considered. And also, they don't necessarily prevent future displacement population risks, which takes us to the last slide before closing. To ensure retrofit equity into the future, what kind of concerns and challenges are outstanding that need to be addressed? So we have 3 here to highlight: the risk of renoviction, the longer term risk of gentrification, and this long-term capture of green value or rent. So in terms of renoviction, according to the 2023 housing law, in stressed housing markets, new lease agreements have price limitations. There's a reference price index that's set at the level of the Spanish state by the ministry, where you can enter the address of a flat and it will tell you the minimum and maximum rents that are allowed to be charged in these zones. But if a landlord retrofits, they are allowed to increase rent by up to 10% above the price ceiling that's indicated in this index. So if a tenant is already living in the flat, the landlord can't raise the rent mid-contract unless there's a prior written agreement between the two. So it's kind of unclear how renoviction might play out in these kind of contexts, but there is a scope, especially if the price indexes are not being complied by the landlords, which does happen. In terms of the longer term risk of gentrification, modernized buildings with greater comfort, like balconies and lifts, that have also been structurally repaired and have lower utility bills, that are close to public transit hubs, will become more attractive and can allow landlords to maximize the upper limit of the official rent index. Or what's happening in many places is to convert these units into short-term rental properties for digital nomads, for anyone who cannot get a long-term lease. And this is something that is happening to bypass the rent control mechanism. So this is definitely a huge risk in the long term in this context, but we have yet to see what will actually happen in Sant Ildefons. And then this final point in the long-term capture of green value and rent, we know from a lot of studies that property values usually increase after retrofit. So there's this big question of how to address the intergenerational debt if the 100% grant is taken by households, by vulnerable households. So this creates like an intergenerational inequality as well and overly penalizes vulnerable households. And there's this also, ending on this point, of this very big question of how do we address the privatization of public funding for the common good? So this is public funding that is eventually going to increase the property value of individual private households. So how can we think more critically about that and maybe create mechanisms to redistribute money in the long term. So on that note, thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to the questions and comments you might have.